We're going to look in Daniel chapter 6 today. There are questions that are asked that on the surface the answer seems to be quite simple, but sometimes that's not the case. I have an example here I want to share with you that they seem simple on the surface, but when you start looking at the correct answer, it becomes more involved than we think. For example, how long did the 100 Years' War last? Anybody? 116 years. Which country manufactures Panama hats? China. Ecuador. From which animal do we get catgut? They use for sutures and things like that. The answer? Sheep and horses. Which month do the Russians celebrate the October Revolution? In November. What was King George's first name? See, you're worried now. Now, his name was Albert. We have tests for driver's tests, drug tests, polygraphs to see whether someone is telling the truth or not, sobriety, eye exams, entrance exams. Is there a test to determine a person's faith? And the answer is yes. It's called obedience. It's called doing what God has called us to do, no matter what the situation might be. Daniel was a very, very young man when the Babylonians took control of Israel, of Judah, and he was taken into Babylon, and you can read the first 5 chapters of the book of Daniel, that he was an exceedingly intelligent young man. He becomes very, very involved in the government of the Babylonians. They try to get him to become like them, and he refuses to do that. That's in chapter 1. But as we continue through his life, in chapter 5, we come to the point where the Babylonians are the great power, but they're going to fall. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and we get a phrase that is very obvious to us. It's called the handwritings on the wall. It comes out of Daniel 5, because that's what Nebuchadnezzar sees. He sees this handwriting, and Daniel interprets this for him, and he says the handwriting's on the wall, that their kingdom is about to fall, and the Medes and the Persians are going to take over what was the Babylonian Empire. Well, during this time, Daniel again rises to the top, and there are those people who are not going to be very happy about Daniel not being one of them yet, having that kind of authority. At the time that we see this in chapter 6, Daniel's about 80 years old. So he has this habit of praying. And these people that don't like Daniel, that don't really want him to be in the position he's in, are looking for something about him that they could use against him, and they really can't find anything. So they end up trying to use his faith to create a problem for him. So they're going to set this trap. What they do is they get the king, Darius I believe his name was, they get the king to sign this law that says nobody can pray to any other god for the next 30 days, I think it was. But you see, Daniel had the habit of praying 3 times a day, just as any Jewish person would do in that time. They want to discredit Daniel. They want to destroy Daniel. And one of the things that we have to realize is Daniel is a child of God, and he's living in a pagan country, just like we are. Now, I think it's quite interesting that 200 and some years after the Revolutionary War, that people came here to our country because of tax problems, and they wanted freedom of religion. And here we are ready to fight that same battle again 200 years later. We are Christians that live in an ungodly and non-Christian society. And that's where Daniel's at. And we have to understand there are those people that have problems with people that believe in Jesus. There are those people that don't want us around. Several years ago, there was a representative in in a certain state that was speaking, and one of the things he said in his speech was that our country would be a whole lot better off if we could just get rid of the Christians. That the country would be improved if these religious people weren't around to be against all these things that we want to do. So if we're going to live for God, there's always going to be those people that are out to get us. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that we should be paranoid, but there's always those people that want to do something to harm. Sometimes they might even pretend to be Christians, but their purpose is to harm what God wants to accomplish in our lives. So they will set out to do that. You know, I remember a young man from another town years ago. He attended this particular church. He was wanting to do what God wanted him to do, but he was out for the football team in this particular school, and he was having some problems because after every practice, there were some of the players that wanted him to go out into the country, into this cornfield where they went, and drink. And he didn't want to. And they kept making fun of him and did everything that they could do, and finally he gave in. And one night after practice, he went out with them, and he got drunk and he got sick. And he came to me afterwards and talked to me about the situation, and he said, "You know, Joe, they laughed at me because I wouldn't go with them, and then they laughed at me because I did. And I have chosen that they can laugh at me for not going with them from now on." There are those people that want to see us fall. There are those people that want to harm us in some way, to discredit us as far as our faith in God is concerned, to try to destroy the very foundation of Daniel's life here, trying to destroy his faith. And they want us to fall so they can do what? Point the finger and criticize. I thought you were a Christian. Well, as I say, it can happen with people that pretend to be friends. It can be from people that pretend to believe. You know, I was at Central one time. There's a professor there that I got to know. Bill Walton was his name, and I was down there just to visit for a day or two, and they had an introduction to preaching class. And I just wanted to sneak in, just sit there and listen to see what they were talking about. And Bill Walton saw me, and he asked if I had any words of wisdom to share with these young men that were going to go in the ministry. And initially I said, "No, not really. No, that's okay. I just wanted to listen." But he kept after me. So he said, "If there was one word of wisdom that you could share with these young men going to the ministry, what would it be?" And folks, here's what I said. Don't assume that every member of your church is a Christian. That they're going to act like they're a Christian, they're going to talk like they're a Christian, or that they really believe. Don't assume that, because you're going to find yourself very disappointed in believing that. There are those people that want to do harm to us because of our faith. And they set this trap for Daniel, that if anybody prays or worships another god, then they can be put to death. So Daniel hears about this decree. And what does Daniel do? He goes home, opens up his window toward Jerusalem, and prays. He knows what these people are doing. He doesn't go to the king to appeal it. He doesn't protest against it. He does not file some lawsuit against the constitutionality of it. He doesn't go through all of this. He just continues to do what he's always done. He continues to worship his God, no matter what these people are trying to do. He quietly ignores that. There's no grandstanding. There's no big speech that he makes. He doesn't do it in the middle of town. He just continues in his own way to worship the God in whom he believes. He doesn't hide. He doesn't forsake his prayers. He knew the trap was there, but they're not going to alter his faith. He's going to remain the person that God wants him to be. And he still trusts God in the midst of this. So what happens then is there's this test. Now there's still some discussion among those people who know a whole lot more than I do about why the lion's den. There seems to be some indication in the laws of the Medes and the Persians that they would do this, and if you lived through the night, you were innocent. If you got eaten by the lions, you must have been guilty. Okay? Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? That's a system that I would really have a lot of trust in. But if we make a stand for God, there are times that we may find ourselves in some pretty tough spots. If we're going to stand where God wants us to stand, there may be times we find ourselves in very difficult situations. There are times that we're not going to escape the trials of life. There are times that we're not going to get away and be protected by God from all the harm and things that go on. That doesn't, just because I'm a Christian doesn't mean that God is going to make my life smooth. Okay? And sometimes it makes it even more difficult. I think of the Apostle Paul. He had life made to him. He became a Christian, and his life's an uproar for the next 30 years as he serves God. That his own countrymen are trying to put him to death, and he has to watch everywhere that he goes. And the same is true of a lot of people. I think of King David. What was God's name for David? Do you remember? A man after my own heart. But David lost 3 children. 2 sons by violent death, another one just a week old. And in the midst of all that, he is still called a man after God's own heart. That these tests come up for us. Okay? And there's times that we go through these tests, not for God to see how much we believe, but for us to realize how much we believe. As I thought about a good example of this, I know this is going to get pretty deep, so you're going to have to follow me very closely, okay? We all know the story of the 3 little pigs. Okay? They decide that they can move out of home and establish their own place. Okay? So they do. So the first little pig builds his house out of straw. Okay? And the big bad wolf, and if that wolf looks like anybody here at the church, it's complete coincidence. Okay? So the big bad wolf comes and does what? Blows the house down. Pig's in trouble. The second pig decides that he will build his out of sticks and logs, and the big bad wolf comes, and what does he do? Blows the house down. But the third pig builds his out of brick. Okay? And the big bad wolf comes and what? Tries but can't. Okay? 3 pigs, same situation. What was the difference? What they built a house out of. You will find people that will go through the same, and this is always interesting to me, go through the same circumstance in life, go through the same problems they encounter. And it all comes down to what's my foundation of my life? What have I made my life out of? Okay? And if I have made it with God, Jesus told a parable about the one that built their house on the sand and one that built their house on the rock. And he's talking about the foundation of our life. If it's God, we're going to be able to withstand those things that we'll go through. If it's not, we're going to find ourselves faltering and falling into that. We have a tendency to shy away from tests of faith. We have a tendency to want to be comfortable and decide I don't want to get into all of this. And that's why we see a lot of people that might have been in churches for a long, long time whose faith is so low because they've never put themselves in a spot to be tested. They refuse to do that. Okay? When I was a senior in high school, for reasons that you will never find out, I took Algebra 4. I still don't know why. Well, I do know why, but I'm just not going to tell you why. There was about 6 or 8 of us guys who were friends, and we decided we'd all take the class. And that's what we did. And it was a very interesting experience. Not to discourage anyone younger, but I have never used this in my life. Anyway, we'll go on with the story. So I would sit in class and just kind of stay low so the teacher would not ask me any questions. He was a good teacher. In fact, it's interesting because I found out years later that this teacher that I had in school was the inspiration for Karen Cope to become a math teacher. Okay? So let me mention this to you very quickly. That's not part of the sermon, but Karen's mother passed away quite some time ago, and her father just recently passed away. And they're going to have a graveside service for Mom and Betty and Bill both at Rossville this Saturday. So you might keep all that family in your prayers if you would. Okay? But you know, Karen told me that one day, that this teacher was her inspiration. So it wasn't the fact that this teacher was a bad teacher. She just had a bunch of bad students. Okay? So I would just sit there and just let her go on and on and on and all this. And whenever she looked that way, what did you do? You just smiled. Yeah, we got that. Okay? But the worst words that I ever heard, ever, in Algebra 4 was, "There's a test Friday." Why would you do that to us? Why?
To see your brain.
Was you about to see what you've learned, to see what you know. It's a matter of progress. God puts us in places to be tested for that very reason. Okay? That very reason, that He wants us to test our faith so we know what it is. He already does. But we may not be aware. And if our faith is not growing, folks, if your faith isn't stronger now than it was 6 months ago, it's not God's fault. He is putting you in positions to help you grow in your faith. But we have to accept those. We have to accept those tests, and we have a tendency not to do that. Are we guilty of making Christianity a religion of convenience? Oh man, this is great when things are going well, but what when we're out in the world? Are we guilty of saying, I don't really want to do that? I don't really want to get involved in that because it may cause me something in my life that I'm going to have to change. It's easy to compromise. That's what I see, quote, the church in general doing in our world today. Continuing to compromise. Just stepping back each time, allowing the world to make their statement and saying, like Europe did with the Nazi Germany in World War II. Let's just give them what they want and they'll leave us alone. And then they just keep going and keep going. It would have been easy to compromise, very much so. But then our faith never grows. To have the courage to stand for what's right, to have the courage to stand for what God has said is the ultimate goal of our lives, I hope. I hope. Daniel chose character over comfort. I think it's a very, very amazing thing that when they looked at Daniel's life to find something that they could use against him, the only thing they could find was that which dealt with his faith. His character evidently was superior. He was an honest guy. And they couldn't find anything except in a matter of his faith, so they went after it. And through all of this, Daniel didn't hide his faith. He didn't flaunt it. But he didn't hide it either. That he continued to worship God and to show his faith. And the test of loyalty is what Daniel is looking at, what God is looking at. Okay? Wouldn't it be a great thing that we would realize that if we get these contests, these tests of faith, that we are showing the world what we really believe? That we're making a stand so the world can look and say, those people believe what they say they believe. The world needs to see our faith. It's easy to compromise it when immorality is the norm of our society. That people of faith are people that are unique. That we don't see them very often. They talk the talk, but they never walk the walk. They claim to be Christians, but we never see that in their life. It's like a guy once said that he told me, he said, I believe in Jesus, I just don't let him interfere with my personal life. Wow. Or the man that is having problems in his life and he comes to talk to me and one of the first things he says to me is, Joe, can we leave Jesus out of this? And my response is, that's why you got the problems you got right now, because you've left Jesus out of this. The world needs somebody to stand up. I see it all over the place. Ungodly people wanting somebody to stand up and speak the truth. Wanting somebody to make a point. And that's what Daniel's going to do here. To interfere with your personal life. Like the Indian, that American Indian that went to his first church service. And they asked him what he thought of the sermon. And his answer was, a lot of wind, some thunder, no rain. I wonder if people would look at us and say that of our faith. They do a lot of talking, they make a lot of noise, but in the end, nothing. If you come here on a Sunday morning, folks, and you walk out the same people you were when you walked in, it's not God's fault. You weren't ready. You're not willing. You're not looking. You're not desiring for God to put you to the test. You're not looking to find your life in a way with God. Testing is something that we need. If not, we're not going to grow. If not, we're going to become very, very weak. There was a man named Dr. Gordon Alley's. Anybody ever heard that name? He was the pioneer in developing insulin for diabetes. That he was one of the first ones that looked at what was going on. He spent his life trying to develop, and he did develop insulin for diabetes. But the time came when Dr. Gallus died. You know what he died of? Diabetes. With all the knowledge that he had, with all the resources that he had, he died of diabetes. Why? Because he had all this knowledge, he had all these resources, but he never acted upon it. And we can be the same way in our faith, that we have all this knowledge. My goodness, the world is overrun by knowledge anymore, isn't it? Not a lot of wisdom, but a lot of knowledge. We have all the resources, yet we never act upon our faith, therefore it never grows. And we end up dying of the very thing that we proclaim is the cure. So they grabbed Daniel, they put him in the lion's den, and we see the trust that Daniel had. Even when he is challenged, he still knows God's in control. And there's many times I've had discussions with people that I don't know why God does the things that he does. You can look at my office, there is no hotline where God calls me and says, Joe, I'm doing this because. I struggle with the same things that you struggle with. I don't know why certain things happen the way they happen. But what I do know is that I believe in a God I can trust. I know he's working. I know he's doing the right thing, even though I have no idea what the right thing is. And there's many times I'm thankful that God's around with the right thing, because I don't know what it is. I can't understand. We think we know. We think we know what's right, what's wrong. We know what's best and what's not best. I just talked to the kids downstairs about Jonah. He preaches to Nineveh to repent, and Jonah gets mad because that's not what he wanted. He thought he had this figured out. And when God doesn't act the way that he thought he should act, Jonah is angry. We don't see that here in Daniel. He chose to love God. His first allegiance was God. That's where his loyalty would rest, and he could trust God no matter what. He was determined to serve God, no matter if the situation seemed impossible. What would you thought if you end up in a den of lions? No, Randy, not Detroit. Real lions. What would you think? Wow. Wow. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Daniel is there in the lion's den. There's no denial of his God here, is there? There is no compromise with the people. He's not going to dishonor his God. Daniel's not going to. He's not going to. There was a couple of guys that were out west, and they were going down this trail, and all at once, one of them see this big brown bear. So the one, they both take off, and the one is much faster. He gets to this tree. He goes up the tree to get away from the bear, but his friend isn't quite so fortunate. He can't make it, so he ends up just falling on the ground, pretending like he's dead. So the bear comes up, sniffs him, whispers something in his ear, and walks off. So when he's sure that the bear is gone, this guy in the tree comes down to his friend and says, "What did that bear say to you?" The bear said, "Never again should you travel with someone that will desert you in the first sign of danger." Well, I believe in God, Marge, I do. But boy, when there's a problem, I'm going. You know, that's one of the greatest things I see in churches today is this absolute, complete lack of loyalty. That there is no loyalty. Boy, as long as it's convenient for me, as long as everything is fine, boy, I'm right there. But you have some kind of friction, you have some kind of problem, and we're just like this guy and the bear. I'm going, God. I'll come back when things are better, but boy, not right now. The ultimate measure of a Christian is not where we stand in the times of comfort, but where we stand when we're challenged. When the world stands before us and demands an answer from us. And I don't quite understand a lot of times because, boy, don't we have the answer. It is so very, very simple what God has for us to do. God tests us, and some tests are far more crucial than other tests, but He continues to test us because we need it. We need to develop our faith. We need to develop our character here. And one of the things that, we'll get to this in some other sermons through the weeks here, but one of the things is that God did not show His power to Daniel until he was in the lion's den. Okay? We keep asking Him to spare us from that. And that's not what's best for us. It's when he's in the middle of this trial that God shows His power to him. It is when that he is in the midst of this that God shows His presence with him. We will never experience God like Daniel experienced God because we won't let it get that far. We'll give up before we ever get that far. We'll compromise before we ever get that far. We're not going to allow ourselves to be put in these spots. And what a shame. What a shame that we fail to see God's power work in our lives because we'll never allow God to put us in the lion's den. We'll never allow ourselves to be put in a spot to be challenged like that. So we have no idea. I think all the time, I think of Peter walking on the water. He experienced something with God that nobody else is ever going to experience. They can say, I was there and I watched, but they did not get out of the ship. See, I want to be someone that gets out of the ship. I want to be someone that can experience this with God. And I pray that you are too. Scott Shaw and Karen would identify with this. I don't know how much you know about China, but there is the state-supported church, and then there's the underground church. Okay? Just for your information, we get newsletters from Scott. And on the heading of it, it says, do not post. He told me he thought that we would be safe here, but it's illegal in China what he's doing. Okay. And they know for a fact that the Chinese are sending officials to the western end of the United States to go to churches to see what they can find about them. Scott has been held. He wasn't ever arrested. At one time when we talked, he thought he was going to get kicked out of the country, which would be the least problem that he could have. Okay? So what happens with these underground churches? Who was it, President Bush, that went to China a few years ago? There was such an uproar because he went to the state-supported churches. Now, you know what that is? That is the church that the state tells them what they can preach. Okay? But these underground churches are much smaller because they have to be much smaller. That normally they will go 15, 20, maybe 30 people, and when you get that large, they separate. And they meet in different places, and they never meet the same place twice in a row because the government's watching. And if you are arrested for that, you're put in jail, you lose your job, you lose your home, you lose everything. Okay? There was this particular incident that happened, that's what happened. And the man that took his place, the same thing happened to him. And as the church was telling this missionary what had happened with them, the missionary says, well, I'll bet you have a hard time finding people to take that spot then, don't you? And the response was, we have a waiting list of people that want to become the head of that. Wow. Folks, if it was illegal for you to come here this morning, would you be here? Now, it's easy for us to say, oh, yeah, but would you? If you knew the Watsika City Police or the Iroquois County Police, the state police, whoever it might be, was standing out here waiting for you to step foot on the church property to be arrested, where would you be at this morning? See, that's where Daniel was at. And we say that would never happen in our country, but I'm not certain that we can make that statement anymore. Okay? That there are things at play here in our society that is attempting to isolate the church even more. Our government now, you know, we've had this big problem over the insurance paying for contraceptives and abortion pills and things like that. You know what is at the root of this? That our government wants to define what a church is. It's not what we think it is, but what they want it to be. I just got an email last week that Hobby Lobby is filing a lawsuit against the federal government because under the law they will have to pay for abortion pills and abortions and contraceptives and all that. And I don't know where your stance is at. That's up to you. That's up to you. But because they have no other relief, they found out they're going to have to file this lawsuit, trying to get them exempted from all of this. That the squeeze is being put on. Are we as Christians going to stand here and make that stand for God? Look what happens. If you read the story, what happens in this whole thing? Daniel's obedience to God opened the door for God to work. It's an amazing story. You read it because Daniel is very calm with this. Okay? It's the king that can't sleep at night because he likes Daniel. He didn't want this to happen. So he's up all night, and Daniel, very calm, very collected. And when they get there, the king cries out, "Daniel, did your God save you?" And Daniel's answer is what? Yep. I don't know if he is a yep or not, but yes, he did. Okay? And what does the king do? He gives this proclamation now that you have to worship the God of Daniel. Wow. See, it's not all about us. In fact, more and more I'm beginning to realize it's not about us at all. It's about him. It's about bringing glory to God. And Daniel's obedience, his stand of faith, his unshakable faith, impacted and influenced some very, very important people. And our faith can do the same. That we impact, we influence people when we make our stand for our faith. And the result is that God is proclaimed in this pagan country. That he is honored, that he is glorified. Because Daniel did not allow the circumstances to control him. He did not allow those things to lord over him. He knew God was in control. That he worshiped God and revered God more than he feared the lions. Oh, there's the key, is it not? To revere God more than we're afraid of the world, afraid of the rejection. Because there are those people that will reject, but there are those people that are waiting to hear. God will vindicate us. If we decide it's better to face a bunch of lions than it is an angry God, and make our stand where we ought to, draw our line in the sand, then God is going to vindicate us if we remain faithful. What would have happened if Daniel had quit praying? What would have happened if he would have compromised his faith? I mean, we would have made a case for that. All he has to do is leave his window shut, do it in private where nobody can see, then he escapes this whole thing. But what would have happened? You see, God would have never been acknowledged by the people of this country. That God would never have been glorified in all that was going on there. I wonder, what would have happened if Daniel would not have drawn his line in the sand? But see, along with that, folks, I wonder, what are we missing because we won't? That we won't draw our line in the sand for God. Back in the 1970s, in Fairfax County, Virginia, they bought new fire helmets. And boy, they looked nice. They were exactly what they wanted, and the fit was really great. They found there was just one problem with these fire helmets, is that they melted when they got in fires. What good is a fire helmet that melts in fire? We can claim that we are Christians, and boy, we can look good at it. But what happens when we melt, when we're faced with a confrontation with God? It's not our power. It's not our ability. It's God's, to allow Him to work. And we have to give Him that opportunity to work in our lives, to make the stand, so that God will be acknowledged in the world in which we live. Our hymn of invitation and dedication this morning